All right, we're back. So we've got a bit of a mining panel here. I'm joined by Piers, Lincoln, and the Greenpeace destroyer, Daniel Batten. Should we start off? Let's just go down the line, introduce yourselves, let everyone know what it is that you do.
Good day, everyone. My name's Piers. I run a Bitcoin mining business in Brisbane called MineRacks. Offer hosting to people who want to get into mining, and also help construct very small scale compared to iron immersion container based mining solutions for energy companies.
Hi, afternoon all. My name's Lincoln Tan. I lead investor relations at Iron. Iron is a Aussie company, but listed in the NASDAQ, and we are the largest listed Bitcoin miner that uses 100% renewable energy.
I'm Daniel, and I split my time between fighting FUD on Twitter and spending time in an infrastructure financing company that specializes in Bitcoin mining companies who put their rigs on landfills and use stranded renewable energy.
All right, well, I think after the last few days, the perfect place to start, Daniel, is Greenpeace. What's going on there? Tell us a bit about the disinformation campaign that they've launched. Let's tell Ripple to go fuck themselves, and give us a bit of the background.
Okay, so just see a raise of hands. So who knows a little bit about Greenpeace USA's Change the Code campaign? Who's heard of it? Okay. Who's aware of the latest report they brought out about this week? Who's heard of that? Okay. So to fill you in, so what happened this week is that they brought out a report, and what they tried to do is to make out Satoshi Action. Who's heard of Satoshi Action? Okay. So Satoshi Action, I'll back up a little bit. It's led by a guy called Dennis Porter, and they're doing some amazing work around the US right now in helping make sure that at a state-by-state level, states have the right, or Bitcoin mining companies have the right to continue to mine Bitcoin no matter what crazy, stupid, ignorant policies are done at a federal level. They've done some amazing work. And Greenpeace USA ran a report where they basically tried to do a smear campaign on Satoshi Action and link them to climate deniers and right-wing activists and stuff, which is kind of crazy because I'm one of the supporters of Satoshi Action and I'm a climate activist, right? So it's total nonsense. They picked one or two people and tried to malign an entire organization back on this. But they distributed a lot of the usual FUD, which happens all the time, and I can basically spin on a dime and tell you what it is, as you probably all can too, and that is Bitcoin is bad for the environment because it uses a lot of energy. It uses more energy than pick your favorite country. But if Bitcoin was to change to proof of stake, then it could mitigate its emissions. But Bitcoin miners are these selfish people that are just too stubborn to do it. And that's kind of the narrative, and it's Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. It's become the immigrants are taking our jobs. It's one of these lovely slogans that sounds superficially appealing to someone who doesn't want to do a lot of deep intellectual thinking about a subject, but it sounds appealing, right? And when you're dealing with an energy illiterate population, then people are likely to think, yeah, well, if it produces energy, it uses a lot of energy, doesn't do anything useful because the use case of Bitcoin has not been portrayed at all in the mainstream media. So in lieu of knowing what its use case is, you assume it does nothing. So you have this thing that's portrayed as a speculative asset. It uses a lot of energy. Well, that doesn't sound good. Well, now you've got a populace who is prepared to get behind a government who says they want to ban it, they want to tax it, they want to quasi-ban it, whatever. So Greenpeace USA has really been leading the charge in a lot of that misinformation. The misinformation comes from two sources, but if you go back to the original source, it's central banks. It's the Central Bank of the Netherlands, Alex de Vries. It is the Bank of International Settlements, and it's the European Central Bank. And then what happens is that information, because remember, central bankers, they're the ones who get disintermediated by Bitcoin. So they're the ones who stand to have the most to lose. And we see this happen all the time, right? We saw this with the horse and cart industry. They didn't just roll over when automobiles came in. They fought it with FUD. We saw it with the print media. When the internet came along, they didn't just roll over. They treated the internet with FUD and said it's going to use all the world's energy. So you use the attack vectors of the time. Greenpeace has picked them up. And so a lot of my role has just been to debunk a lot of these myths with data, with peer-reviewed research, but informs where people can understand it and can circulate that to other people who are intellectually curious.
And I think it's important to note that this disinformation campaign has been funded by Chris Larsen from Ripple. He's given them $5 million, I believe, to start spreading this misinformation, and they can all go fuck themselves. But let's not spend any more time on that. Piers, so this FUD has been ongoing for a long time now. As Daniel said, this is people criticizing Bitcoin for the amount of energy that it uses, but not taking into account the fact that it is also helping to stabilize grids. It's unlocking new sources of energy. Do you think that this narrative is beginning to change?
It is, and I want to especially call out Daniel for his role in changing that narrative. I sat on this same stage and spoke to you guys last year in this same seat, and I told you about my experiences trying to get Bitcoin going with local Australian energy companies. And the moment, I told you then last year, the moment you mentioned the B word, your project is killed, regardless of its merits, regardless of its environmental benefits, regardless of the economics of it, you're just instantly turned off. Too much of a career risk to even touch it. But the work Daniel's done and the resources that he has highlighted has changed that game. And in the time since, I've actually been able to make use of the information that he's created and the resources and the dispelling of FUD, such as, for example, the KPMG report, the Cambridge reports that are now available to us to help dispel those prejudices and get past the boardroom checks to the point where I'm now actively working on what Daniel set out to achieve, which is methane mitigation through landfill gas projects. So right now in Queensland, we are taking landfill gas out of a landfill. This is your and my rubbish that we throw out every day, and converting that into energy, which instead of being simply leached out into the atmosphere, 80 times more potent as a warming agent than CO2. Instead of that happening, we're actually burning it cleanly in generators, turning it into electrons, and then turning it into Bitcoins.
So we're definitely going to come back to that kind of waste energy side of it. But Lincoln, at Iron, you guys are operating obviously in Canada and in Texas. And in Texas especially, you're operating with ERCOT and you're doing demand response, which is another very important aspect of what Bitcoin mining can actually offer the grid. Do you want to I think it'd be really good let's go right back to the start and explain actually what demand response is and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So this is not a bad real example of, I think, the positive role that Bitcoin mining can have on energy grids globally. ERCOT, which is the grid in Texas, that's a completely deregulated market, which means the energy prices there are constantly changing throughout the day. Where we are in the sort of northwest of Texas, there's a massive penetration of renewable energy. It's about 80% mainly wind and solar. What that creates when you combine with very limited transmission capacity to where people actually live, like we've got 32 gigawatts of generation, 12 gigawatts of transmission.
Will you just put into context what that actually, what that looks like? How much energy is that?
I couldn't actually.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, right? But what that means is when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, energy is basically free. But equally, if it's a hot day, you've got generation that's not online, you've got millions of people wanting to switch on the TV and the air cons and watch the footy, you're really running into the chance of rolling blackouts. So Bitcoin mining, and we've got about 2 gigawatts of pipeline in Texas. I think we're running about 60 megawatts there at the moment, going to 300 this year. That acts as a perfect demand side battery where you can't switch off the schools, you can't switch off the hospitals, but there's nothing stopping us from curtailing our load, getting paid to do that in the case of demand response programs where we enroll our load in there. The energy, but basically the grid has the opportunity to shut us off at their election to basically contribute to grid stability, right? So you're not having to hurt the punters who want to watch TV and have the aircon on.
So this is when you'll hear about large storms in Texas, and miners actually getting paid more to not mine Bitcoin than they would if they use that energy and mine Bitcoin. But Piers, do you want to talk about why Bitcoin mining is so uniquely positioned to play that role?
Because we can respond to free power. We can soak up any power that is currently wasted. We will always be there to buy power that no one else wants. So in the example of one of the sites where we're working on right now, our customer there is generating constantly landfill gas, and they are constantly turning their generator. They can't turn their generator off when the grid no longer needs that power or doesn't want to pay for that power. So as a result, they need to be able to divert that energy to something that will pay them. Otherwise, they can't, because they can't turn their generator off, sometimes they have to pay the grid operator to leave their energy still going into the grid. So in other words, you get penalized for continuing to produce reliable power day in, day out. So you've created an economic disincentive to give you, the customer, what you want. That's ridiculous. So that's where we step in. We can take over because solar power essentially is getting outbid, is outbidding the production capacity of the stable power production generators. So by us effectively being able to put a floor under the price of power for generators, those that do operate a reliable generator can continue to get paid and produce better economics for their operation.
So we're obviously talking about the Texas grid here, and the reason it's very relevant to Bitcoin mining is because a huge amount of the hash rate is actually located in Texas. And in the United States, they have large subsidies to build out huge amounts of solar and wind energy. And I'm going to throw a bit of a grenade in here, because I think Daniel and Piers may disagree on this, but do you think that the increased build out of these renewable energies is actually good policy and it is a good idea for the grid in Texas, or is it a misstep? I'm going to go to you first, Piers, on that.
Hands up everyone who's been to a solar farm, a commercial-sized solar farm. Hands up everyone who's been to a wind farm, an actual wind farm. And hands up everyone who's been to a modern coal-fired power station. Which of those three futures did you like the best from an environmental standpoint? If you've been to a coal-fired power station, I'm going to particularly single out CS Energy's station at Cockram Creek near Queensland, near Brisbane. It is an amazing facility. It is so high-tech and so well-run. It is a national tragedy that we are shutting some of these plants down. Because if you've seen the environmental destruction that comes with the production of a solar farm or a wind farm, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I would rather, as an environmentalist, see us having more nuclear and coal-fired power than the destruction that we're wreaking on our Earth with solar and wind.
Can I just jump in there? So I'm very bullish on nuclear, but please, I've not been to a coal plant. What is it that you see there?
Essentially, you see no visible signs of emissions. The plants are extremely well run. They operate on a very small physical footprint compared to, say, a solar or a wind farm. They actually produce very little environmental damage by comparison, in my opinion, from a density and a land use point of view. And they certainly don't create a visual impact on thousands or millions of people as you drive through Europe, and you see, well, basically you have windmills almost everywhere blocking your view of the great outdoors and what would have been untouched nature. But setting aside those environmental, I guess, subjective opinions, having a power production source where we are essentially just producing power when the power station feels like it, rather than when the demand is there to pay for it. And I think fundamentally that's going to create an economic schism. Now, as a Bitcoin miner, I'm quite happy to take advantage of that and pick up the power that's being produced when no one else wants it. But as a society, we could organize ourselves a heck of a lot better than by responding to these perverted incentives that have been created for us by government.
So, Daniel, I think you're going to have a rebuttal on that.
No, I don't really want to get into that actually. I think the wonderful thing about Bitcoin mining is that it invites everyone, and one of the incredible things is it's just an incredible user of stranded energy and cheap energy. And 20 years ago, most of that cheap energy would have been natural gas and coal. Today, most of it is variable renewable energy and off-grid hydro. So the reason that most of the Bitcoin network is starting to go to renewable sources of energy, sustainable sources of energy, it's simply economics. Bitcoin mining companies will go to where the cheapest source of power is. And if that's landfill gas, they'll go there. And if that's off-grid hydro, they'll go there. And if it's natural gas, as it will be in some cases in Russia and other parts of the world, they'll go there. But they'll use stranded assets that otherwise people just couldn't use at all. And it's incredible. And I want to shine the light on what Iron is doing as well and other companies on ERCOT, because it's worth understanding a little bit about grids because they're fascinating. So I'll try and put it in a real layperson's terms. When grids operators have to constantly balance supply and demand, unless you've got batteries, and batteries can only give you up to 4 hours of storage, right? So if you've got some wind farm in some part of the country that's producing 72 hours of straight wind, what are you going to do with it? You can't store it in a battery. So Bitcoin mining companies provide this ideal ability to be able to soak up that power that otherwise would have been completely wasted, and that makes these renewable generators more efficient. So I think what's happened is people have different opinions about whether it's the right strategy to use more variable renewable. I don't want to get into that. What I'm more interested in is saying you've got a tremendous amount of variable renewable energy in ERCOT that has already been built. Most of it is completely useless because it's in the wrong part of the country, because it was built to government economic incentives, which was just to build it, but not to utilize it. So you've got all this energy, which is in one part of Texas, in the west part, and all the users are in the east part of Texas. And how do you transport it? Because often you get, just like on a highway, you get congestion, you get grid congestion. And often there might be a surplus of wind or a surplus of solar where people can't use it. And then you get these peak weather events. You get these big storms, or you get winter storms, or you get these summer heat waves, and everyone puts on their aircon at the same time. Everyone puts on their heating at the same time. And the grid operator's freaking out because they've got more variable renewable energy on the network than ever before. So that you can't say to a wind operator, oh, can you generate more wind? They're constrained by what nature's providing. You can do it to a coal plant. You can do it to a gas plant. You can ask them to put more coal in the fire and basically fire up and increase production. So the only way, if you're going to have a grid which has more variable renewable energy on it, you have to have flexible users of that energy. And that's people like Iron, that's people like the other Bitcoin mining companies. So one thing that's happened on ERCOT is now that you have this consumer side flexibility where you can go to Iron and you can say, hey, can you please power down because we're about to reach peak capacity? If you didn't have Bitcoin mining companies like Iron, etc., on that grid, the only choice would be you'd have to have a gas peaker plant, and you'd have to ask that gas peaker plant to increase the generation. So now, rather than having to have generation flexibility, you can have consumer of energy flexibility. Now, why is that important? Well, for one thing, those gas peaker plants, they use a lot of energy. It's fossil fuel based. But the other thing is they're really expensive. They cost tens of millions of dollars. And in the last 3 years, ERCOT, the grid of Texas, has not needed to buy any new gas peaker plants because of Bitcoin mining companies. So that saves the grid massive amounts of money, massive amounts of infrastructure deployment. So it's the fact that Bitcoin mining companies are flexible users of energy is making the grid owners' life easier, and it's actually driving down the prices of electricity for retail users.
And I think, we talk about energy transition and decarbonization and these sort of global trends, right? That challenge in ERCOT is getting more and more challenging, where there's, as I mentioned, 32 gigawatts going to 40 in the next couple of years. We've got retirement of thermal generation for base load. You've got utility scale batteries, obviously economics quite challenging in parts. The transmission to export that energy to where anyone lives, there's zero network upgrades planned around where we are. So to your point around the perfect demand side battery, I think, it's a really great example.
So, Link, you've Iron are quite nicely geographically distributed. You have, is it 2 sites in Canada? Is that right? And then 1 in Texas.
Three in Canada,
3 in
3
Canada.
in British Columbia, and 2 in Texas.
Okay, so Texas has become, like, after the China ban, the hash rate capital of the world. Like, numbers are between 30 and 40% of hash rate is based there. Do you have any worries about miner centralization in one state, or do you think that's a misnomer and something we don't need to worry about?
I'm not too worried about it in terms of like decentralization, etc. Like, mining hash rate will just migrate to where it needs to go, and whether it's in your home garage, basement, whether it's at the utility scale where we are, whether it's in Kazakhstan buying 2-cent gas, whatever, like, you're just responding to economic signals and game theory. So yeah, I'm not too worried about that.
Okay, anything you want to add on that?
I know that there are people out there mining, even though the economics don't add up. Those mined coins are KYC free. No one other than the miner knows that they have those coins. That creates an enormous economic incentives for individuals who have access to either cheap or subsidized or free power at their homes or in their businesses to make use of that and arbitrage that. Equally, there are other niche applications, hash to heating, for example. We've retrofitted a Bitcoin miner into a swimming pool in Brisbane, and we have basically that swimming pool is nice, warm and toasty all through winter, thanks to the owner mining Bitcoin to keep his pool heated off his solar panels. So no matter what happens, the mining hash rate will be decentralized. Whether it is primarily decentralized in the bulk of the hash rate in Texas, that's probably a risk we have to run. But yeah, certainly it will be widely geographically distributed, come what may.
I love that. All right, so to kind of Lincoln's point, and I'm going to throw this to you, Daniel, our mutual friend Troy Cross talks about Bitcoin mining being the dung beetle of energy, meaning that it will go and find the cheapest sources of energy possible. Do you want to explain that theory and how that's actually playing out in practice? And I'm kind of specifically thinking of the companies like Vespine, Nodal, etc.
So a dung beetle does something really useful. It takes something that no one else wants, dung, and it turns into something really useful. And so Bitcoin mining companies do the same thing. They turn energy that no one else wants, no one else can use. It's in inconvenient places. It's impossible to monetize profitably. It's completely stranded. It can be solar that no one wants at the wrong time of day, wind that no one wants, hydro in Paraguay that flows over the top of the dam that's beyond the possibility that anyone could use it, landfill gas, flared oil and gas. And it's able to soak up that energy because it's something very unique, and it's an economic factor. And that is, there's never been an industry in the world where 80% of your operational costs is power. And it's incredible. Because of that one fact, that's what drives the economic incentive for Bitcoin mining companies to go to these really crazy, strange places and invest extra capital expenses to seek out this cheap power. Now, for a traditional data center, it would make no sense, because if only 30% of your operational costs are electricity, then it's not a big enough incentive to go and invest all this capex. So, for example, in a landfill, it's really expensive in terms of capex to get that power. You've got generators, you've got to install gas capture and collection systems. It's going to cost you millions of dollars. Well, why wouldn't you just hook up to a dam? Well, the reason is that you can get much, much cheaper power. And because so much of your operational costs are power, it makes sense for you to do that. Now, because of that unique factor, what happens is all this stranded, this wasted energy that's just in the world, and quite often this wasted energy is also an environmental hazard because it's flowing from a coal mine in the form of methane into the air, or a landfill into the air, or from a farm into the air, contributing to climate change and all the rest of it. No one else profitably can mitigate this. It's like someone in the UN said recently, no, it was actually it wasn't UN, it was Exxon. Someone in Exxon said, everyone wants to reduce methane emissions, but no one wants to pay for it. And I did a tweet which says, everyone wants to reduce emissions, no one wants to pay for it except Bitcoin miners. They're the only ones who want to pay for it, not because they're doing something good for the world, but because there's an economic incentive. Because for them, that's not emissions, that's fuel. They're looking at that methane going to the sky saying, That's crazy, man. We should be turning that into the future of sound money. And it makes sense for us to do that. We've never had, ever in the history of civilization, a user who is positively incentivized to mop up things which are an environmental hazard to this extent. And something like methane, it's not just a climate hazard, it's also a health hazard. I was saying in my talk before, methane emissions cause over 1 million premature deaths every single year through asthma, through respiratory illnesses. So that's more than the number of people who died through COVID and suicide combined in the last 12 months. So again, what's people doing about this? Nothing. Why is nothing happening? Because it's not profitable, except for Bitcoin mining companies. So when Troy Cross says it's a dung beetle, that's probably the best metaphor you can imagine, because it's dealing with things people don't want to look at, people don't want to sniff, people don't want to deal with. And it's, for the Bitcoin mining company, that's their food source, that's their fuel source. That's potential Bitcoin going to waste.
And you've done a lot of work at trying to map out sort of the carbon footprint of the Bitcoin network. And you believe that we'll get to a point where it is actually a net negative.
There is no doubt.
Positive.
There is no doubt in my mind we'll reach a point where Bitcoin is abating more emissions than it's creating. Zero doubt. The only question is, at what point do we get there?
And in your sort of projection of this, where do you think we are and where do you think we can get to?
So at the moment, 7.5% of Bitcoin's network emissions is mitigated through methane mitigation. So that's people like Crusoe Energy who are using flared gas from the oil and gas industry, people like Vespine, Nodal Power, Marathon, DC2 on landfills, or people who are using farm emissions and they're turning it into basically electricity, electrons, and then using that for Bitcoin mining. So 7.5, so 1 in every 13 parts of emissions is currently mitigated through methane mitigation through Bitcoin mining, which is incredible because no other industry in the world has achieved that. Now, that's just scratching the surface. If we start to target venting sources of methane, so these are sources of methane that are just freely going into the air, no one's trying to burn them, then we can go 10 times faster. And we have the theoretical potential that this decade we could turn the entire Bitcoin network to emission negative, where we're actually abating more emissions than we're creating. The other key thing is that the emissions of the Bitcoin network, well, by the way, of course, there is no direct emissions. It's fully electrified, so it's like your EV. It doesn't create any direct emissions. It creates secondary emissions like an EV through the underlying generation source. So that's an important distinction. That's why whenever I see someone with an ASIC with a Bitcoin miner, I say, you just stick a zero emission sticker on that thing, because it blows people's minds. But it's true. It's got just as much right to claim zero emission as an EV does. So we're at the point now where it's absolutely possible that we could go completely emission negative. And there's no other industry in the world that can do that without having to buy carbon credits or offsets.
And maybe we should talk about carbon credits. Piers, are carbon credits a scam?
Yes.
All right, done. Do you want to?
Look, I don't think I know enough about. I haven't studied the climate science to the same standard as other members of the panel. But as a Bitcoiner, I'm naturally skeptical, and I believe that the science is far from settled. And so I would like to continuously question the mainstream narrative that we've been fed so far. And I do question whether the expenditure, the blank check that we're writing to respond to the climate emergency as it's being marketed to us, it is in effect a slippery slope towards a system of control that none of us Bitcoiners really want in our futures.
And this is why like the pure economic incentive of Bitcoin mining is so powerful. So Link, you at Iron have recently sort of had a big push into AI as well as Bitcoin mining. Do you want to start with why that is? Why did you look at that as an opportunity?
Yeah, look, I mean, specific to Iron, we fundamentally build data centers, right? They just happen to be data centers that are quite far away from where people live and use 100% renewables and are specialized for power dense applications. If you go to your NextDC, your Equinix over in Macquarie Park or Alexandria, those racks are pulling like 5 to 10 kilowatts per rack. You come to our data center in the same physical footprint, you're pulling 70 kilowatts into that same space. Creates massive challenges in terms of cooling and managing these things appropriately. When you're renting floor space in the Sydney CBD, it's going to cost what it costs. We've got hundreds of acres where, you know, it's freezing cold and very efficient to kind of manage those workloads. So things like AI, where we're seeing an explosion in new use cases that are, you know, potentially transformative, the compute needed to power AI training workloads, they sit sort of somewhere in between the 30 to 40 kilowatt per rack range versus sort of 10 versus 70. And they are, I guess, pretty suited to sitting within our facilities as well. You know, like if I can give you renewably powered compute for AI at a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to do in Manhattan or Sydney, and it's fit for purpose because we've still got 20 millisecond latency to availability regions, like, yeah, it's pretty compelling.
And something I'm unsure of, how does that play into the demand response? Is it equally viable as a demand response option, or is that always going to be the Bitcoin mining?
Oh, look, potentially. I mean, today we do it in Canada mainly, and the reason for that is our Texas project's a work site at the moment. But you know, there's no reason why I can't respond, right? Like if you're training a model and you're constantly checkpointing progress into storage, if someone switches you off and you get paid to do it as a startup, as an AI startup, why wouldn't you take the money, right? You just switch it back on 20 minutes later when the grid reserves come back to a suitable level, and it helps reduce your cost of energy, which is a key input into running data centers.
All right. So a lot of this conversation has been based around the grid in Texas specifically, and understandable as there's so much hash rate there. But one thing that I'm very ignorant on is the amount of hash rate that is here in Australia and kind of the unique challenges that we have. So Piers, I know you mine here in Australia. How big is the industry here?
It is quite small, certainly by international standards, but mining is present in every major city and in many, many rural areas. And I could take you around Brisbane and show you where a whole bunch of mines are that you wouldn't know exist. I've been to a site where someone's converted their underground car park into a Bitcoin mine. I could take you to visit my friend who's got a pool heater running on his Bitcoin mining. There's an industrial area where a friend of mine who makes cake and cake supplies is running an immersion bath. So it is widely distributed and scattered. There are very few industrial scale mines here. The ones we have had have gone overseas, such as Mawson's that used to be up near Byron Bay.
Why is that?
I think it's due to energy costs and the operational problems of operating in the environment here. Obviously, it's a hostile regulatory environment, and it's also a hostile social license to operate environment, meaning that it's very difficult to get community consensus to get behind the idea of Bitcoin mining, particularly when you're dealing with local government.
So there's places in Australia, like South Australia in particular, that is has such a huge opportunity in terms of the renewable energy that we've talked about. They have the opportunity to have huge amounts of wind, huge amounts of solar. So is it a regulatory reason that that's not been tapped into?
Generally speaking, most energy companies in Australia have deep ties or deep connection to government at least 2 or 3 different levels. Generally, there's a hostile environment towards Bitcoin mining in particular. And as a result, you see little appetite to do large industrial scale mines of the size that you're familiar seeing in Texas or in Canada. But that being said, there are container scale mines. So you'll find in South Australia, I know of one site where there's multiple 40-foot containers mining off solar farms that have excess solar production. In Tasmania, there's a container-sized mine down there that's powered primarily by hydro. So there are these little isolated pockets, and of course there's landfill gas in a couple of different areas and wind farms where some small scale mining is taking place. But the vast majority, I believe, of hash power is just evenly distributed through individual homes and businesses from dedicated Bitcoiners like us.
Very cool. Well, I hope we see some more of that. But so Daniel, you have a fund that is looking to invest in these projects. Where is it that you see like big opportunity going forwards?
Well, we specialize in landfills. So basically anywhere where there's a trash heap that cannot sell its power to the grid because either the grid upgrade would cost too much or because some sort of regulatory bureaucracy prevents it. That's the first criteria. Secondly, it's got to be a certain size because the infrastructure that's required to mitigate gas from landfills is not cheap. So beyond a certain size, it doesn't really pencil out economically. So it has to have about 1,500 tons of trash coming in per day as a rough guide. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is it has to have a landfill owner who actually is interested in the project. And that's the most important thing. If you don't have that, then the other things don't really matter that much. Now, the good news is from the landfill owner's point of view, if they're sufficiently open-minded that they just don't go, okay, Bitcoin, evil, bad, no. I always suggest to people, you don't lead with Bitcoin. You don't go to a landfill owner and say, let's talk about the future of sound money. That's not where you meet them. You've got to meet them where they're at. And what do they care about? Well, they care about producing more money from their resource. And they care about making sure that you're not going to make the business as usual job harder. And they care about removing a source of regulatory pressure they could be facing, but also a health hazard. Because let's face it, landfills are not the places you typically take your family for a holiday. So they're dirty, smelly places. It's a health hazard to work there because you're inhaling methane the whole time. So anyone who works on a landfill, that's a major health risk. Anyone who lives in a 6-kilometer radius, that's a major health risk as well. So the value proposition to a landfill, you say, we can take this stranded asset that's just going freely into the air that's causing health issues for you and other people that's smelly. We can take away most of the smell, all of the health hazard, all of the regulatory pressure, and we can give you back power, which is going to cost you, which is going to pay you in many cases $30,000 per month, depending on the size. And the amount of money you invest is zero because we'll finance that. And the amount of land footprint we take up is at 1/20th the size of a football field. So from a landfill owner's point of view, it's all in how you pitch it. If you go in there talking about future of sound money, forget it. But if you go in there talking about how you can help improve their lives and give them a more profitable landfill and actually take away some hazards that it has right now, then they'll be really interested. And then you just got to walk them through that this is not too good to be true and what the process looks like. And then basically a Bitcoin mining company forms a power purchase agreement with the landfill owner over 10 years. So that gives cost certainty to the Bitcoin miner and revenue certainty to the landfill owner. And then suddenly they're looking at a 10-year power purchase contract, which might be worth over $3 million. Well, that's $3 million more than they're going to get right now. And they haven't had to invest anything. And all that it really costs them is the ongoing effort to maintain that gas field and to tweak some valves, and you're talking about 4 hours of one person's time every 2 days. So it's a pretty good equation when you're talking about the economic upside. So really what it comes down to is more Bitcoin mining companies being able to meet the landfill owner where they're at, putting their own passion about Bitcoin to one side for now. They can come online later, and explaining to them the economic value of this proposition. And if you can do that, that's the only constraint, is having more landfill owners who are prepared to say yes to this idea. And then we can have a whole lot more Bitcoin mining companies who are doing this throughout the world.
Well, a couple of years ago, we had Adam Wright from Vespine on the show, and he told a story about when he went to one of the first one of the first landfills that he was proposing this idea to. And he was saying, we should just mine Bitcoin here. And the landfill owner said, but how do you know there's Bitcoin in there? So, like, there's obviously
That's why you don't lead with Bitcoin.
There's obviously a deep misunderstanding there. But to me, like, landfills, whether it's here in Australia or in the US, there's like a double incentive where they have sort of the EPA saying you have to do something with this emission. But
Oh, absolutely. In the US, it's even more of a no-brainer because their choice is they're being regulated. So their choice is, would you like to pay $1 million for a flare stack to destroy a potential source of revenue, and then the multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars per year potentially, or over the course of 2 years, or would you like to pay nothing and earn money off it?
So that one seems like a very obvious buy, but like there's obviously huge landfills in places like Indonesia, India, like all across the world. How do you try and tap into that market, which would really like move the needle on the sort of decarbonization of the Bitcoin network?
That's the right question to ask, and that's a question that I ask myself on a weekly basis. And the answer is you have to start with something which is small, which is lower risk, because the reality is that these landfills are not actually landfills, they're open dumps. And the key difference there is it means that, so a modern landfill, it'll typically be a low surface, a short surface area, but very deep. So you get very good compression. So that's really good for methane production. The other thing about a landfill is it has these perforated vertical wells that go deep into the landfill that are designed to release the methane from the landfill itself into the air. Now, why would they do that? Well, they do it for health and safety reasons. If you have a modern landfill and you're driving heavy machinery over the top and suddenly you get a methane bubble, that you could get subsidence that can cause loss of life. Well, the other thing is with methane, that's pretty combustible. They can catch a light. Well, that's not good if you've got people operating on the landfill. So for health and safety reasons, modern landfills will have to have these perforated vertical well shafts throughout the landfill that release that methane gas into the air. Now, in the developing world, you don't have any of that. And so that means that it's harder to get the gas out of the landfill. You've got to retrospectively get these massive augers and drill into them and put the well shafts in place. So that's going to cost more money. The other thing is that these landfills are likely to have caught on fire, which is really bad for methane production. And there's not as much compression, so there's less certainty about how many megawatts of energy you can extract. So we've got to start with these landfills, which are modern landfills, which it's easier to assess how much methane there is, and they have some of the gas collection already in place. Start there, prove the model, and then once you've done that, then you can look at these places like open dumps in India or in Nigeria or Southeast Asia or Pakistan or India, because no one knows what to do with them. They're a huge issue. There's land issues, and they were supposed to get level with the ground. They're now forming these trash pyramids. We have to drive a truck up, and it's getting higher and higher and higher and higher. Well, you can only do that for so long until the whole thing doesn't work anymore. It's literally a pyramid scheme. It falls over at some point. It's a pyramid of trash. So it's getting progressively harder to fill these landfills out. No one knows what to do with them. But you get these smog problems in these whole areas through all the chronic methane that's been leaching out of them. They're horrendous places, and literally Bitcoin mining is the only thing that can profitably mitigate them, to such the extent that the UN is even Bitcoin mining and artificial intelligence data centers are the only two forms of pre-vetted methane mitigation by the UN. Even the World Economic Forum is shining the light on this and saying we have to use Bitcoin mining to do this sort of methane mitigation. So there really has been a big narrative shift, but we've got to start with the ones that are economically easier and lower risk. Once we've done that, then we can start to turn our mind to these open dumps. And the story there gets even better because there you have rubbish pickers who work on these open dumps day and night, earning a livelihood scavenging for trash. You can imagine the conditions. It's been called hell on earth. And what you do in these projects is you close the landfill and you give them meaningful work. You build a waste separation facility. You give them proper protective clothing so they don't get syringed when they're scavenging for trash. You pay them a living wage. And the incredible thing is, this is actually a case where carbon credits work, because the carbon credits that you generate on that project will be worth a lot more because of the social good factor as well. So it is absolutely possible. We've got to start with the lower risk options.
All right, bullish on landfills. So we're less than a month out now from the halving. On behalf of every Bitcoiner here, we appreciate the sacrifice in halving your revenue as Bitcoin miners. Let's go down the line and give me a bit of a prediction of what you think the mining industry will look like in 6 weeks' time post-halving.
I have absolutely no idea. I really don't know how it's going to pan out. One thing I do know, though, is in contrast to sort of Daniel's experience, the landfill gas sites where I work are actually quite pleasant places to be. I think in Australia, we're very privileged in that we do have some very strict environmental standards and just ways of doing things that lead to a better quality of life for all of us. So in the site where I'm working right now, you would have no idea that you're standing on top of a gigantic pile of rubbish because it's beautifully landscaped, gorgeous grass, trees are now growing on top. You would have no idea what it was. And that site has been happily producing gas for almost 60 years. This is something I did that surprised me when I got into landfill gas, is that there's the same concept of radioactive half-life, in that the amount of gas a landfill will produce will sort of have a curve that drops off like this. So you might start off with a site that can produce 2 meg, and over time it drops to maybe a meg worth of power. But it's incredible how long these sites last and how cheap the energy is that comes out of it. So yeah, the average cost of producing power at a landfill gas site in Australia is 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can imagine how attractive that is for a miner. So whether the halving halves the amount of Bitcoin we make or not, when you're paying 2 cents for your power, you're still happy.
All right, I'm going to let you get away with that answer, but we're not having that again. Lincoln, I want to know what you think the landscape looks like in the near future.
Well, we think about this a lot as a listed miner. Look, over the last 2 years, there's been a proliferation in global hash rate, like it's over 600 at the moment. It is just crazy. I think it might get bumpy and a little bit volatile. As much as we want to say, you know, it's going to drop off 30%, I just don't think that's going to happen. I do think
You think less or more?
I think less, right? People are still adding, ourselves included. We're going from 7 exahash to 20 exahash. I think where the growth comes from will be quite different, because if you're capital constrained, if you are running expensive energy, if you haven't got the best machines, you better have cheap power. And access to cheap power is obviously getting more and more challenging as the hash rate grows. So, you know, I think the big guys with balance sheets and capability and capital will continue to grow. But I think, you know, if you're running expensive operations, old machines, you're going to feel a bit of a pinch through the halving.
Daniel, anything to add on that?
Yeah, 2 things. Number one is it's going to drive more and more and more innovation. Bitcoin mining companies will have to get more and more innovative about how they access cheap power. And second thing, it's going to drive innovation in terms of, so there's 2 things you can do. You can reduce expenses or you can increase revenue. That's all you can do. So how do you increase revenue? Well, you get sources of revenue other than Bitcoin mining. So what might they be? It might be selling ancillary services to the grid, demand response. It might be heat recycling and getting revenue from heating up some fish tank, right? Or whatever it is, or drying timber. It might be carbon credits. It might be fill in the blank. But Bitcoin mining companies will look for these ancillary sources of revenue, not just because it improves the balance sheet, but also it gives them diversity during bear markets, which is going to be super important. I've seen some of the articles saying a lot of companies are going to go under, they're going to be liquidated post-halving. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the big flush out has already occurred during the last bear market. Warren Buffett once said, when the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked. And we found out there were some people who've been swimming naked. Either they'd taken their cost of capital, they'd bought their ASICs when they were really, really expensive, or they hadn't locked down good power purchase agreements, or they'd simply were using power that was too expensive. They've already been liquidated. So I don't think it's going to make a big difference.
All right. Well, that was amazing. Thank you to all the panelists. Give it up.